Marcus Webb came into this world on a cold February night in Detroit, Michigan, in a small hospital where the heating system barely worked and the nurses wore extra sweaters under their uniforms. His mother, a young woman named Denise, held him close to her chest and whispered promises she hoped she could keep. She promised him safety, she promised him love, and she promised him a life better than the one she had known. But life in their corner of Detroit had a way of breaking promises before they could take root. The neighborhood where Marcus grew up was a place that time had forgotten. Once upon a time, these streets had been alive with workers coming and going from the automobile factories that made Detroit famous, but those days were long gone now. The factories stood empty like giant metal skeletons, their broken windows staring out at streets where hope came to die. Houses sat abandoned on every block, their porches sagging and their yards overgrown with weeds that nobody bothered to cut. The people who remained were the ones who had nowhere else to go. Marcus lived with his mother and father in a small house on Greer Street. The house had belonged to his grandmother, a woman named Lucille, who everyone called Mama Lou. Mama Lou had passed away 2 years before Marcus was born, but her presence still filled every corner of that old house. Her curtains still hung in the windows, her dishes still sat in the cabinets, and in the basement, covered with dust and surrounded by boxes of forgotten things, sat her piano. Marcus was 7 years old when he first discovered the piano. It happened on a summer day when the heat outside was so heavy that the air itself seemed tired. His father, a man named Raymond, had gone to work at the warehouse where he loaded trucks for 10 hours a day. His mother had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from her night shift at the hospital where she worked as a cleaning lady. Marcus was bored in the way that only a 7-year-old can be bored, when every minute feels like an hour and the whole world seems to be moving too slowly. He had already played with every toy he owned. He had already watched every show that the old television could pick up with its bent and had already eaten the sandwich his mother left for him and drunk all the juice in the refrigerator. There was nothing left to do except explore. The basement door had always been closed. Mother told him not to go down there because the stairs were old and dangerous, and the basement sometimes flooded when it rained. But on this day, with nothing else to capture his attention, Marcus found his hand reaching for the doorknob. The door creaked open like it was surprised to be disturbed after so many years of silence. A smell rose up from the darkness below, a smell of old things and dampness and secrets waiting to be found. Marcus found the light switch on the wall and flipped it on. A single bulb hanging from a wire lit up the space with a weak yellow glow. Walked down the stairs slowly, holding onto the railing that wobbled under his small hand. At the bottom of the stairs, he stopped and looked around at a world he never knew existed in his own home. There were boxes everywhere, stacked on top of each other and covered with dust so thick it looked like gray snow. There were old chairs with torn cushions and lamps with broken shades and picture frames, holding photographs of people Marcus had never met. But in the corner, half hidden behind a tower of boxes, he saw something that made his heart beat fast. It was big and black and shaped like nothing else in the basement. Marcus walked toward it, pushing boxes out of his way. As he went, when he finally stood in front of it, he realized what it was: a piano. He had seen pianos before, on television shows where fancy people in fancy clothes played music in fancy rooms, but he had never seen one in real life, and he had certainly never expected to find one hiding in his own basement. The piano was old and dusty like everything else down there. Some of the white keys had turned yellow with age, and the black keys were covered with a film of grime. The wood was scratched in places, and the bench in front of it had a tear in the cushion where the stuffing poked out like cotton candy. But to Marcus, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He sat down on the bench and faced the keys for a long moment. He just looked at them, afraid to touch them, afraid to break whatever spell had brought him to this place. Then, very slowly, he lifted his right hand and pressed down on one of the keys. The sound that came out was soft and sweet and sad all at the same time. It filled the basement and wrapped around Marcus like a warm blanket on a cold night. He pressed another key and another note joined the first, then another and another, until he was pressing keys with both hands, not knowing what he was doing but feeling like he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The sounds he made were not music, not yet. They were just random notes bumping into each other like strangers on a crowded street. But somewhere inside those random notes, Marcus heard something. He heard a voice that seemed to be calling to him. From very far away he heard a door opening to a room he never knew existed. He heard the beginning of everything that would come to define his life. Marcus did not know how long he sat at that piano. He did not know that upstairs his mother had woken up and was calling his name with panic in her voice. He did not know that she had searched every room in the house before finally opening the basement door and finding him there. All he knew was that when she came down the stairs and saw him sitting at Mama Lou's piano, she did not yell at him for going where he was not supposed to go. Instead, she stood very still at the bottom of the stairs with tears running down her face. She walked over to him and sat down on the bench beside him. She put her arm around his small shoulders and pulled him close. "That was your grandmother's piano," she said, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper. "She used to play it every single day, Marcus, and when she played, the whole neighborhood would go quiet just to listen. She always said that music was the only thing in this world that could not be taken away from you, no matter how poor you were, No matter how hard life got, nobody could reach inside your heart and steal the music that lived there. Marcus looked up at his mother and saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. It looked like hope, but also like pain, like she was remembering something precious that she had lost and might never find again. Can you teach me to play like she did? Marcus asked. His mother shook her head slowly. I never learned, baby, and I always wished I had, but maybe you can teach yourself. Maybe the music is already inside you, just waiting to come out. That night, after his father came home from work and the family ate dinner together in silence like they always did, Marcus asked if he could go back down to the basement. His father looked at him with tired eyes and shrugged. Do whatever you want, Raymond said. Just stay out of my way. So Marcus went back down to the basement and sat at the piano until his mother called him to bed, and the next day he did the same thing, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of that summer. While other kids played in the streets and complained about the heat, Marcus sat in the cool darkness of the basement and taught himself to play the piano that his grandmother had left behind. He did not know that he had a gift. He did not know that the sounds he was learning to make would one day change his life and the lives of many others. All he knew was that when he sat at that piano, the world outside disappeared. The empty factories and the abandoned houses and the broken promises of Detroit all faded away, and in their place, there was only music that spoke to him in a language he was just beginning to understand, music that would one day speak louder than any words ever could. 5 years passed like water flowing under a bridge, sometimes fast and sometimes slow, but always moving forward towards something unknown. Marcus was 12 years old now, taller than his mother and almost as tall as his father, with long fingers that seemed made for the piano keys he loved so much. In those 5 years, something remarkable had happened. The random notes that Marcus used to bang out in the basement had transformed into real music. He could play songs he heard on the radio after listening to them only once or twice. He could take a melody and change it, adding his own notes and rhythms until it became something new and beautiful. He could close his eyes and let his fingers dance across the keys like they had minds of their own. His gift had grown like a flower reaching toward the sun, and everyone in the neighborhood had noticed. On warm summer evenings, Marcus would open the small basement window to let in some fresh air. While he practiced, the sound of his playing would drift out into the street and float through the neighborhood like perfume. One by one, the neighbors would stop what they were doing and listen. Old Mr. Jefferson from 3 houses down would sit on his porch with his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him like a gentle rain. Mrs. Patterson from across the street would call her grandchildren inside and make them be quiet so she could hear the boy playing. Even the teenagers, who usually stood on the corner making noise, would fall silent when Marcus started to play. That boy got something special. People would say to each other, God put something in that child's hands that most people never get. Word spread through the neighborhood and beyond. People started coming from other streets just to stand outside the Webb house and listen to the music coming from the basement. They would gather on the sidewalk in small groups, swaying gently and nodding their heads. Some of them brought lawn chairs so they could sit and enjoy the free concert that Marcus gave every evening without even knowing he had an audience. For Marcus, those hours at the piano were the happiest of his life. When he played, he forgot about the kids at school who made fun of his old clothes. He forgot about the empty refrigerator that his mother tried so hard to keep full. He forgot about the arguments he heard through the thin walls of his bedroom late at night when his parents thought he was sleeping. The piano was his escape, his sanctuary, his best friend in a world that often felt cold and unfriendly. But not everyone in the Webb house shared his love for music. Raymond Webb had changed over the past 5 years, and not for the better. The warehouse where he worked had closed down 2 years ago, and since then he had moved from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to feel secure. The stress of trying to provide for his family had worn him down like water wearing down a stone. He started drinking beer after work to help him relax. Then the beer turned into whiskey. Then the whiskey turned into whatever he could afford on any given night. The man who used to come home tired but gentle now came home tired and angry. He would sit in his chair in the living room and drink until his eyes went glassy and his words started to slur. And the sound that bothered him most, the sound that seemed to crawl under his skin and make his blood boil, was the sound of that piano coming up from the basement. Turn that noise off, he would yell down the stairs. I work all day and I come home and I have to listen to that banging and clanging. Marcus would stop playing when his father yelled, sitting in silence until he heard the snoring that meant Raymond had fallen asleep in his chair. Then he would start again, softer this time, pressing the keys so gently that the music was barely louder than a whisper, but Raymond always seemed to hear it. No matter how quiet Marcus tried to be. I told you to stop, he would roar, stomping down the basement stairs with fury in his eyes. What is wrong with you, boy? Why can't you listen? Marcus would sit frozen on the piano bench, watching his father's face turn red with anger. He learned to read the signs, to know when his father was too drunk to climb the stairs and when he was just drunk enough to be dangerous on the bad nights. Marcus would close the piano and go to his room without being told. He would lie in bed and move his fingers in the air, playing invisible keys, hearing the music in his head even when he could not play it out loud. One night, things went too far. Marcus was playing a song he had been working on for weeks, a beautiful sad melody that seemed to capture everything He was feeling inside. He was so lost in the music that he did not hear his father's footsteps on the stairs. He did not see the shadow falling over him until it was too late. Raymond grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and spun him around on the bench. His breath smelled like alcohol and his eyes were wild with a rage that Marcus had never seen before. "I told you," Raymond said through clenched teeth. "I told you 100 times that music don't mean nothing. Music don't pay rent. Music don't put food on the table. Music is for people who got nothing better to do with their lives." Marcus tried to speak, but no words would come out. His father's grip on his shoulder was so tight that it hurt. "You want to know what your grandmother's piano got her?" Raymond continued. "Nothing. That's what, a whole lot of nothing. She played that thing every day of her life. And what did she have to show for it? A broken-down house in a broken-down neighborhood, and not enough money to pay for her own funeral." Tears started to roll down Marcus's face, but he did not make a sound. He had learned a long time ago that crying out loud only made his father angrier. "You're going to end up just like her if you don't wake up," Raymond said. "You're going to waste your whole life chasing something that don't exist. There ain't no future in music, boy, not for people like us with that." Raymond reached past Marcus and slammed the fallboard down on the piano keys, but Marcus's fingers were still resting on the keys. The heavy wooden board came down on his hands with a crack that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Marcus screamed. The pain shot through his fingers and up his arms like fire. He pulled his hands back and held them against his chest. Sobbing now, unable to hold back the sounds of his pain, Raymond stood there for a moment. Looking at what he had done, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret or shame, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Maybe now you'll listen," he said, and then he turned and walked back up the stairs. Marcus sat alone in the basement, cradling his injured hands, crying tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his eyes. His fingers throbbed with pain and were already starting to swell. He was afraid to look at them, afraid to see how badly they were hurt when his mother found him an hour later. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. She took him to the emergency room where a tired doctor wrapped his fingers and told him nothing was broken. "Just badly bruised. You were lucky," the doctor said, but Marcus did not feel lucky. He felt like something inside him had been broken that night, something that no doctor could wrap in bandages for the next 2 weeks. Marcus could not play the piano. His fingers were too swollen, and too sore to press the keys. He would go down to the basement and sit on the bench and just look at the piano like it was a friend he could no longer reach. The silence was worse than any punishment his father could have given him during those 2 weeks. Marcus made a decision. He would not give up his music, not for his father, not for anyone, but he would have to be smarter about it. He would have to protect the thing he loved by hiding it from the person who wanted to destroy it. From that day forward, Marcus only played when his father was at work. He memorized his father's schedule and planned his practice time around it. He became like a thief in his own home. Stealing hours with the piano when no one was watching it was not the same as before. The joy of playing was now mixed with fear. The beauty of the music shadowed by the memory of that night, but Marcus kept playing because the music was all he had, and he would not let anyone take it away from him, not even his own father. The moving truck arrived on Greer Street on a gray October morning when the leaves were just starting to turn brown and fall from the trees. Marcus watched from his bedroom window as 2 men unloaded furniture and boxes from the truck and carried them into the house 3 doors down. That house had been empty for almost 2 years, ever since old Mrs. Coleman died and her children sold everything and moved away. Nobody in the neighborhood expected anyone to move in, especially not the kind of person who stepped out of the car that day. She was a white woman, which was unusual enough on Greer Street, where almost everyone was black, but more than that, she looked like she belonged in a different world entirely. Her hair was silver and pulled back in an elegant style. Her clothes were simple but obviously expensive, the kind of clothes that whispered money instead of shouting it. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place on this street of cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and nobody could figure out why she was there. The neighbors talked about her constantly in those first few weeks. Some said she must be crazy, a rich old white lady moving to a neighborhood like this. Others said maybe she was hiding from something, running away from a life that had gone wrong somehow. A few of the older folks remembered hearing her name before, something about concerts and music and fame, but nobody could remember the details. Marcus did not pay much attention to the gossip. He had his own problems to worry about. His father's anger had gotten worse since the night he slammed the piano on Marcus's fingers. The drinking had increased and the jobs had decreased, and the house had become a place of tension and silence, broken only by sudden storms of rage. Marcus spent more and more time in the basement, playing his grandmother's piano whenever his father was gone, losing himself in music that felt like the only safe place left in his world. One afternoon in late November, Marcus was playing a piece he had created himself. It was a complicated melody that moved between happiness and sadness like a conversation between 2 old friends. He had the basement window cracked open just a little because the furnace made the room too warm. He was so deep in the music that he did not notice the shadow that fell across the window. He did not see the face of the woman who stood outside, listening with her eyes closed and a hand pressed against her heart. The next day, there was a knock at the front door. Marcus's mother answered it and found Eleanor Vance standing on the porch with a stack of papers in her hands. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said in a voice that was soft but clear. "My name is Eleanor Vance and I just moved in down the street. I was wondering if I might have a word with you about your son Denise." Webb looked confused and a little worried. "When strangers came asking about your child, it usually meant trouble. What about my son?" she asked carefully. Eleanor smiled, and her whole face seemed to light up with warmth. "I heard him playing the piano," she said. "I was walking past your house and I heard the most remarkable music coming from somewhere inside. I stood there for almost 20 minutes, just listening, unable to move. Whoever is playing that piano has a gift that I have rarely encountered in my entire life." Denise's face changed from worry to surprise to something that looked like pride. "That's Marcus," she said. "He taught himself to play on his grandmother's old piano. Been playing since he was 7 years old. Would it be possible for me to meet him?" Eleanor asked. "I would very much like to speak with him about his music." An hour later, Marcus found himself sitting in Eleanor Vance's living room, drinking tea from a cup so delicate he was afraid to hold it. The house looked different from the others on the street. It was filled with books and paintings and photographs of places Marcus had only seen in movies. But what caught his attention most was the piano that stood in the corner of the room. It was a grand piano, bigger and more beautiful than anything Marcus had ever seen. The wood was dark and polished until it shone like a mirror. The keys were perfectly white and perfectly black, without a single chip or scratch. Marcus could not stop staring at it. Eleanor noticed where his eyes had gone and smiled. "The piano has traveled with me for 50 years, she said. "I have played it on stages in New York and Paris and London and Tokyo. It has been my companion through the happiest and saddest moments of my life." Marcus looked at her with new eyes. "You're a piano player?" he asked. Eleanor laughed softly. "I was a concert pianist," she said, "for 40 years. I performed with orchestras around the world. I played for presidents and kings and queens. I won awards and made recordings and lived a life that most people can only dream about." "Then why are you here?" Marcus asked. Before he could stop himself, he immediately felt embarrassed by his rudeness. But Eleanor did not seem offended. "That is a fair question," she said. "I came here because this is where I was born, not in this house, but in this neighborhood. A long time ago, before you or even your mother were born, I grew up on these streets. Marcus and I always promised myself that one day I would come back." Marcus could not believe what he was hearing. This elegant woman with her expensive clothes and her grand piano had grown up in the same broken neighborhood where he lived. It seemed impossible. "I left when I was 16. Eleanor continued. "A teacher heard me playing and helped me get into a music school far away from here. I spent the next 50 years traveling the world, and I barely thought about this place, but lately I have been thinking about it more and more. I have been thinking about the girl I used to be and the dreams she had and the people who helped her along the way. And I have been thinking about what I want to do with the time I have left." She leaned forward and looked at Marcus with eyes that were sharp and kind at the same time. "When I heard you playing, Marcus, I heard something that I have not heard in a very long time. I heard fire. I heard a young person playing like their life depended on it, like the music was the only thing keeping them alive. I used to play like that when I was your age, and I think I can help you play even better." Marcus felt his heart beating fast in his chest. "You want to teach me?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "I want to teach you everything I know. I want to give you the same chance that someone gave me a long time ago, but I have to warn you, Marcus, it will not be easy. I am a demanding teacher and I will expect a lot from you. I will push you harder than you have ever been pushed before, but if you are willing to work, if you are willing to sacrifice and struggle and never give up, I can help you become something extraordinary." Marcus thought about his father in the basement and the fear that had become his constant companion. He thought about the music that was the only good thing in his life. He thought about the future that had always seemed so dark and empty. "Why me?" he asked. "There must be lots of kids who can play better than me." Eleanor shook her head. "I have heard hundreds of young pianists in my life," she said. "Most of them play the notes correctly, but they play them like robots, without feeling, without soul. You play like someone who is running from something. Marcus, I can hear the pain in your music, the longing, the hope that refuses to die no matter how hard the world tries to crush it. That is not something that can be taught. That is something you were born with." She reached out and took his hand in hers. Her fingers were thin and covered with spots of age, but her grip was strong. "I want to teach you to play like someone running towards something instead of away from it. I want to teach you to take all that fire inside you and turn it into light. Will you let me try?" Marcus looked at this woman, who had appeared out of nowhere and offered him a chance he never knew he wanted. He thought about everything that stood in his way: his father's anger, his family's poverty, the neighborhood that seemed designed to crush dreams before they could grow. But he also thought about his grandmother's piano waiting for him in the basement. He thought about the music that spoke to him in a language no one else could hear. He thought about the boy who discovered magic in a dusty basement and refused to let it go. "Yes," Marcus said, "I'll let you try," and with that single word, everything in his life began to change. 4 years had passed since Eleanor Vance first knocked on the door of the Webb house. Marcus was 16 now, a young man with broad shoulders and hands that seemed to belong to someone much older. Those hands had spent thousands of hours on piano keys, first on his grandmother's old instrument in the basement, and then on Eleanor's beautiful grand piano in her living room. The change in Marcus's playing was something that people talked about with wonder in their voices. He had always been talented, But now he was something more. Now he was an artist. Eleanor had taught him things he never knew existed. She taught him about the history of music, about the great composers who had lived and died centuries before he was born. She taught him about technique, about how to control his fingers and his breath and his body, so that every note came out exactly the way he wanted. She taught him about emotion, about how to dig deep into his own heart and pull out feelings he did not even know he had. But most importantly, she taught him to believe in himself. You have a rare gift, Marcus, she would say again and again. The world needs to hear what you can do. You cannot hide in basements and living rooms forever. Someday you will have to step into the light. The day came on a cold morning in February. Just after Marcus's 16th birthday, Eleanor sat him down in her living room and told him about something called the Keller Conservatory. It was one of the best music schools in the entire country, a place where the most talented young musicians went to train and learn and grow every year. The Keller Conservatory held auditions for young pianists. Hundreds of students from across America would compete for a handful of spots. Most of them came from wealthy families who could afford years of expensive lessons and summer programs at famous music camps. Most of them had connections in the music world, parents who knew the right people and could open the right doors. Marcus had none of those things. What he had was talent and determination and a teacher who believed in him. I want you to audition, Eleanor said. The competition will be in Chicago in 3 months. If you are accepted, you will receive a full scholarship that covers everything: tuition, room and board, books, all of it. This is your chance. Marcus, this is your chance to become everything you were meant to be. Marcus felt fear and excitement battling inside his chest. The Keller Conservatory was a world he could barely imagine, a world of concert halls and practice rooms and students who had been preparing for this their whole lives. What chance did a kid from Detroit have against competition like that? But when he looked at Eleanor and saw the confidence in her eyes, the fear began to shrink. If she believed he could do it, maybe he could. The next 3 months were the hardest of Marcus's life. He practiced for hours every day, going over the same pieces again and again until his fingers ached and his eyes burned from staring at sheet music. Eleanor pushed him harder than she ever had before, demanding perfection, accepting nothing less than his absolute best. Again, she would say when he made a mistake. Again, she would say when the music was good, but not great. Again, she would say until Marcus wanted to scream with frustration, but he did not scream. He did not quit. He played again and again until the music flowed through him like water and his fingers moved without him even thinking about it. The morning of the audition, Marcus stood in front of the mirror in his small bedroom and looked at himself. He was wearing a suit that Eleanor had bought for him, the first suit he had ever owned. It was a little too big in the shoulders and a little too long in the sleeves, but it was the nicest piece of clothing he had ever worn. His mother stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes. I am so proud of you, she said. No matter what happens today, I want you to know that your grandmother would be proud too. Marcus hugged her tight and tried not to think about his father. Raymond had not said a word about the audition. He had barely spoken to Marcus at all in the past 4 years, treating his son like a stranger who happened to live in the same house. Part of Marcus was glad his father was not there to see him off. Another part of him felt an ache that he tried his best to ignore. The bus ride to Chicago took 5 hours. Marcus sat by the window and watched the landscape of Michigan give way to the tall buildings of the city. Eleanor sat beside him, reviewing the sheet music one more time, giving him last-minute advice that he was too nervous to absorb. When they arrived at the Keller Conservatory, Marcus felt like he had stepped into another world. The building was enormous, made of stone and glass, with columns at the entrance that reached up toward the sky inside. The floors were polished marble and the ceilings were so high that Marcus felt like he was standing in a cathedral. Young musicians walked through the halls carrying instrument cases, their clothes expensive and their posture confident. They looked at Marcus as he walked past and he could see the questions in their eyes. Who is that, and where did he come from, and does he really think he belongs here? The waiting room for the audition was filled with about 50 young pianists and their families. Marcus looked around and felt his confidence draining away like water from a bathtub. The other students looked so polished, so prepared, so sure of themselves. They talked about their teachers and their summer programs and the concerts they had performed at venues Marcus had never heard of. He heard one girl mention that her father was a famous conductor. He heard a boy brag about winning 3 national competitions before he was 14. Marcus sat in the corner with Eleanor and said nothing. A man in a dark suit came out and called names from a clipboard, sending students one by one through a heavy wooden door. Each time the door opened, Marcus could hear the faint sound of a piano, and each time it closed, the sound disappeared like a dream fading after waking. Finally, the man called his name: Marcus Webb. Marcus stood up on legs that felt like they were made of jelly. Eleanor squeezed his hand and whispered in his ear, "Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. Now go show them what fire sounds like." He walked through the heavy wooden door and found himself in a large room with high ceilings and perfect acoustics. At the far end of the room sat a table with 5 judges, 3 men and 2 women, all of them looking at him with expressions that gave nothing away. In the center of the room, waiting for him like an old friend, was a piano, but not just any piano. This was a Steinway grand, the kind of instrument that Marcus had only seen in photographs. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever laid eyes on. One of the judges, a woman with gray hair and glasses, looked down at the papers in front of her. "Marcus Webb," she said, and he could hear the surprise in her voice. From Detroit, self-taught until age 12. Then studied privately with Eleanor Vance. She looked up at him over the top of her glasses. "Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Another judge, a man with a bald head and a frown, leaned over and whispered something to the woman next to him. Marcus could not hear what he said, but he could guess. "Another kid from nowhere, wasting our time. What could he possibly show us that we have not seen before?" The woman with glasses gestured toward the piano. "You may begin whenever you are ready." Marcus walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. He looked at the keys, white and black, waiting for him to bring them to life. For a moment, he felt paralyzed. All the fear and doubt and insecurity that he had pushed down for the past 3 months came rushing up like a wave threatening to drown him. Then he closed his eyes and thought about his grandmother's piano in the basement. He thought about his mother working double shifts to keep the family together. He thought about Eleanor believing in him when no one else did. He thought about his father telling him that music was nothing, that dreams were for fools, that people like them did not get to have the things they wanted. And suddenly the fear was gone. In its place was something else, something hot and bright and unstoppable. Marcus opened his eyes and began to play the music that came out of that Steinway grand. Was unlike anything the judges had heard in years. It was powerful and delicate at the same time. It was full of pain and hope and longing and joy, all mixed together in a way that made the heart ache and sore. At the same time, Marcus played the piece he had prepared, a complicated work by a famous composer that required technical skill and emotional depth, but he played it in a way that was entirely his own, adding colors and textures that made the old music sound new again. When the last note faded into silence, Marcus sat with his hands in his lap and waited. The room was completely quiet. Then something happened that had never happened before in the history of the Keller Conservatory auditions. The judge with the bald head and the frown stood up from his chair. Then the woman with glasses stood up. Then all 5 judges were standing, and they were clapping. Not the polite applause that Marcus had heard through the door all day, but real applause, the kind that comes from the heart. The woman with glasses wiped something from her eye. "Young man," she said, "I do not know where you came from or how you got here, but I am very glad you did." 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Webb house. Marcus's hands were shaking as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Webb," the letter began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to receive the Eleanor Vance full scholarship to the Keller Conservatory." The Keller Conservatory was everything Marcus had dreamed it would be and everything he had feared. The campus was like a small city dedicated entirely to music. There were practice rooms with soundproof walls where students could play for hours without disturbing anyone. There were concert halls with perfect acoustics where famous musicians came to perform. There were libraries filled with sheet music from centuries of composers, some of it so old and fragile that students had to wear special gloves just to touch it. And there were teachers who had performed on the greatest stages in the world. Teachers who knew secrets about music that Marcus had never imagined. But for all its beauty and opportunity, the Keller Conservatory was also a place where Marcus felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life from the very first day. He knew that he was different. The other students came from worlds he could barely comprehend. They talked about their summers in Vienna and their holidays in Paris and the private jets their families used to travel to performances. They wore clothes that cost more than Marcus's family earned in a month. They had smartphones and laptops and tablets, technology that Marcus had only seen in store windows back in Detroit, and they looked at Marcus like he was a stain on their perfect world. Nobody said anything cruel to his face, at least not at first, but Marcus could feel their judgment in every glance, every whispered conversation that stopped when he walked by, every invitation that was extended to everyone except him. He ate alone in the dining hall. He studied alone in the library. He walked across campus with his head down, trying to be invisible, trying not to take up space that he felt he did not deserve. The hardest part was the music itself. At home, Marcus had been the best. Eleanor had told him he was talented, special, destined for greatness. But here, surrounded by students who had been training since they could walk, Marcus realized how much he still had to learn. The other pianists played with a precision that made his own playing seem sloppy and unpolished. They knew things about music theory and composition that Marcus had never even heard of. They could read sheet music like it was a simple book, while Marcus still had to work hard to translate the notes on the page into the sounds he heard in his head. His professors noticed the gaps in his education right away. "Your technique is raw," one of them told him after a lesson. "You have fire." "Yes, but fire without control is just destruction. You have years of bad habits to unlearn before you can become what you need to be." Marcus worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. He practiced until his fingers bled, and then he practiced some more. He stayed up late reading textbooks about music theory, trying to catch up on the knowledge that other students had absorbed over years of expensive education. He listened to recordings of the great pianists, studying their techniques, trying to understand what made them special. But no matter how hard he worked, He always seemed to be one step behind. And then there was Professor Harrison Charles. Harrison was the head of the piano department at Keller. A tall, thin man with silver hair and cold blue eyes. He had been a famous concert pianist in his youth, performing in all the great halls of Europe. Before an injury to his hand ended his career and pushed him into teaching, he was considered one of the best piano teachers in the country, and his opinion could make or break a young musician's future. From the first moment Professor Harrison saw Marcus, something seemed to turn hard in his eyes. Maybe it was the color of Marcus's skin, maybe it was the address on his application, maybe it was something else entirely, something twisted and ugly that lived in the professor's heart. Whatever the reason, Professor Harrison made it his mission to prove that Marcus did not belong at Keller. Sloppy, he would say during lessons. Even when Marcus played perfectly amateurish, he would announce to the whole class after Marcus performed, "I do not know how someone with your background managed to fool the audition committee," he said one day, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you will not fool me." Marcus tried to ignore the criticism. He tried to focus on his music and block out the voice of the man who seemed determined to destroy his confidence. But the worst, the attack came in the middle of Marcus's first semester. Professor Harrison called Marcus into his office and closed the door. On his desk was a piece of sheet music that Marcus had never seen before. "Do you know what this is?" the professor asked. Marcus shook his head. "This is a composition that was submitted to the annual student showcase." Professor Harrison said, "It is quite remarkable, actually. Sophisticated and emotionally complex and technically brilliant." He paused and looked at Marcus with something like hatred in his eyes. "It was submitted under your name." Marcus felt a cold wave wash over him. "Yes," he said, "I wrote it." "I do not think so." Professor Harrison said, "A student with your limited background could not possibly have created something like this. I believe you plagiarized this work. I believe you stole it from someone else and tried to pass it off as your own." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment he could not breathe. You could not think, could not do anything except stand there and feel the world crumbling around him. "That is not true." He finally managed to say, "I wrote every note of that composition. I worked on it for months. It came from inside me, from everything I have experienced and felt and dreamed." Professor Harrison smiled. "But there was no warmth in it." "We will see about that." He said, "I am launching a formal investigation if I find any evidence that you cheated. You will be expelled from this institution immediately." The investigation lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of whispers and stares and assumptions of guilt. 3 weeks of other students avoiding Marcus like he had a disease. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and unanswered phone calls to Eleanor and tears that he cried alone in his tiny dorm room. Marcus packed his bag 3 times during those 3 weeks. Each time, he stood by the door with his suitcase in his hand, ready to walk away from everything he had worked for. Each time, something stopped him. It was Eleanor's voice in his head, telling him that the world would always try to stop people like them. It was his grandmother's piano, waiting for him back in Detroit, believing in him even from far away. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to let Professor Harrison win in the end. The investigation found nothing. There was no evidence of plagiarism because there was no plagiarism. Marcus had written every note of that composition himself. Just like he said, Professor Harrison was forced to apologize in front of the entire department. But the apology was cold and brief, and everyone could see that he did not mean a word of it. The damage had been done. Marcus had been branded as a cheater. And even though he was cleared, the suspicion lingered like a bad smell that would not go away. Some students believed the investigation had simply failed to find the truth. Others felt sorry for Marcus but did not want to risk their own reputations. By being seen with him, the loneliness that had been bad before became almost unbearable now. But something else changed too deep inside Marcus. In the place where the music lived, a new fire began to burn. It was an angry fire, a determined fire, a fire that said, "I will show them all." He would not quit. He would not let them break him. He would work harder and play better and prove to everyone that he had earned his place at Keller. He would turn their doubt into fuel. He would turn their prejudice into power, and one day, he would stand on a stage so bright that they would have no choice but to see him one day. His music would speak so loud that all their whispers would be drowned out one day. He would show the world what a boy from Detroit could become. But that day was still far away, and before Marcus could reach it, he would have to survive the darkest night of his life. Winter break came to the Keller Conservatory in the middle of December while other students packed their designer luggage and headed off to ski resorts in Colorado or beach houses in Florida. Marcus boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Detroit. The ride took 8 hours, and Marcus spent most of it staring out the window at the frozen landscape passing by. He had survived his first semester at Keller. Barely his grades were good enough to keep his scholarship, and he had managed to push through the darkness of the plagiarism accusation without giving up. But he was tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. He was tired in his bones, tired in his soul, tired of fighting against a world that seemed designed to keep him down. Going home was supposed to be a chance to rest and recover. Going home was supposed to remind him why he was doing all this. Going home was supposed to fill him back up with the strength he needed to face another semester. But home had changed while Marcus was away. Or maybe home had always been this broken and Marcus had just been too young to see it. The bus dropped him off at the station downtown, and he took another bus to his neighborhood. The streets looked worse than he remembered. More houses boarded up, more stores closed down, More faces with that empty look of people who had stopped hoping for anything better. When Marcus walked up to his house on Greer Street, he noticed that the porch railing was broken and the front steps were rotting and nobody had bothered to shovel the snow from the walkway inside. Things were even worse. The house smelled of stale cigarette smoke and old alcohol and something else underneath. Something like defeat. His mother was in the kitchen, thinner than before. With dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises, she hugged him when he walked in, but her arms felt weak and her smile did not reach her eyes. "Where's Dad?" Marcus asked. His mother looked away. "He's out. She said he got let go from the warehouse last month. He's been having a hard time." Marcus understood what she was not saying. His father had been drinking more. His father had been staying out late. His father had been sinking deeper into the darkness that had always lived inside him. "I'm going to go see the piano," Marcus said. "I missed it." His mother's face did something strange, then it twisted for just a moment, like she was in pain, before going smooth again. "Marcus, honey," she said, and her voice was careful in a way that made his heart beat faster. "Maybe you should wait your father." But Marcus was already walking toward the basement door. He did not hear the rest of what his mother said. He did not see the tears that started to roll down her cheeks. All he could think about was getting back to the piano that had started everything. The piano that had saved his life. The piano that connected him to his grandmother and to the person he was becoming. He opened the basement door and walked down the stairs. The light switch clicked, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. Marcus pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and swept across the basement floor. And then Marcus saw it, and then his whole world came crashing down. The piano was destroyed completely. Utterly, violently destroyed. It looked like someone had taken an axe to it and swung again and again until nothing was left but splinters and broken strings and shattered keys scattered across the floor like teeth knocked out of a mouth. The body of the piano had been smashed into pieces. The legs had been chopped off and thrown against the wall. The soundboard had been ripped apart, and the hammers had been torn out, and everything that had once made beautiful music was now just garbage. Marcus fell to his knees in front of the wreckage. He picked up a piece of wood that had once been part of the frame and held it in his hands. His grandmother's piano, the first thing he had ever loved, the thing that had opened the door to everything good in his life, gone. A sound came out of Marcus that he did not recognize. It was not a scream and it was not a cry. It was something more animal than that. A noise of pure grief that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. He did not know how long he knelt there in the darkness. He did not hear the heavy footsteps coming down the stairs behind him. He did not smell the alcohol until his father was standing right next to him, so he came back. "Raymond," said. His voice was thick and slurred, the voice of a man who had been drinking all day. Marcus looked up at his father and saw the axe still in his hand. The blade was chipped and scratched from what it had done. "Why?" Marcus whispered. "Why did you do this?" Raymond laughed. But it was not a real laugh. It was a bitter, ugly sound that matched the bitter, ugly look in his eyes. "I told you," he said. "I told you 100 times. Music is nothing. Music is for fools who think they're better than everyone else. You went off to that fancy school and you thought you were something special. Didn't you? You thought you were too good for this place. Too good for your family. Too good for me." Marcus stood up slowly. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "I never thought that," he said. "I just wanted—" "I know what you wanted." Raymond interrupted. "You wanted to escape. You wanted to leave all this behind and never look back, just like your precious grandmother, playing her piano while the world fell apart around her. Well, I showed her and now I'm showing you." He lifted the axe and for a terrible moment Marcus thought his father was going to swing it at him. But Raymond just pointed it at the destroyed piano. "There's your music," he said. "There's your dream. Now you can see what dreams are worth. Now you can see what happens to people who think they're special." Marcus felt something break inside him. It was not his heart, because that had broken a long time ago. It was something else. Something that had been holding him together through all the hard times. Some thread of hope that had kept him believing that things would get better. That thread snapped now, and without it, Marcus felt himself falling into an emptiness so deep that he could not see the bottom. "You're right," he said, and his voice was flat and dead in a way that made Raymond take a step backward. "You're right about everything. I was a fool to think I could be anything I'm not. Going back to that school. I'm not going to play anymore. You win. Dad, you finally win." Marcus walked past his father and up the stairs. He walked past his mother, who was crying and calling his name. He walked out of the house and into the cold December night. He walked without knowing where he was going, without caring, without feeling anything at all. The snow was falling now, big white flakes that covered everything in a blanket of silence. Marcus walked through the empty streets of his neighborhood, past the boarded-up houses and the closed-down stores, past the church where his grandmother used to sing on Sundays, past the elementary school where he used to dream about being something more. He walked until his fingers were numb and his face was wet with snow and tears. He did not remember crying, and then he stopped. He was standing in front of Eleanor Vance's house. The lights were on inside, and through the window he could see her sitting at her grand piano, playing something soft and sad. Marcus stood there in the snow for a long time. He could not go in. He could not face Eleanor and tell her what had happened. He could not see the disappointment in her eyes when she learned that he was giving up, so he turned around and walked away. He went back to his house and packed his bag. He told his mother that he was not going back to Keller. He told her that he was done with music forever. He told her that his father was right all along, and then he disappeared into the world. carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart and the ashes of every dream he had ever dared to dream. The silence that followed was louder than any music, and it seemed like it would last forever. 2 years passed, 2 years that Marcus would later describe as the lost years, the dark years, the years when he became a ghost after leaving Detroit that winter night. Marcus had gone to Chicago. He did not know why he chose Chicago. Maybe it was because it was far enough from home but not too far. Maybe it was because it was the city where he had won his scholarship, the city where his dreams had seemed possible before they turned to a shore. Maybe it was just random, a dart thrown at a map by a young man who had stopped caring where he landed in Chicago. Marcus became invisible. He worked at a warehouse loading trucks, the same kind of job his father had done, the kind of job Raymond had always said was the only future for people like them. He lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat, a single room with a mattress on the floor and a hot plate and a window that looked out at a brick wall. He woke up at 4 in the morning and worked until his body ached, and then he came home and stared at the ceiling until he fell asleep. Did not play music. He did not listen to music when he heard a piano playing on someone's radio or coming out of a restaurant as he walked by. He would cross the street or cover his ears or walk faster until the sound faded or music was dead to him now, and some part of Marcus felt dead too. The only person he stayed in contact with was his mother. She called him every Sunday, and he answered just to let her know he was still alive. She would cry and beg him to come home. She would tell him that his father was sorry. She would ask about his plans and his future and when he was going to go back to school. Marcus would say as little as possible and then hang up. He could not explain to her what he was feeling because he did not understand it himself. That was like he was drowning in an ocean of numbness, too tired to swim, too broken to care if he ever reached the shore. The seasons changed, but Marcus stayed the same. Spring turned to summer, turned to fall, turned to winter, turned to spring again. He watched the world go by from behind a glass wall that separated him from everyone and everything. He was 20 years old and already he felt ancient, used up, finished. And then one Sunday his mother called with different news. Marcus, she said, and her voice was strange, tight with tears. I have to tell you something. It's Mrs. Vance. She passed away last night. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Eleanor, his teacher, his mentor, the woman who had seen something in him when no one else would. Look on, the funeral is on Wednesday. His mother continued. She left instructions that she wanted you there, Marcus. Honey, I know things have been hard, but please, please come home. She would have wanted you to. Marcus hung up the phone and sat on his mattress in his tiny apartment and felt something move inside him. For the first time in 2 years, it was not happiness and it was not hope. It was grief, real grief, the kind that breaks through even the thickest walls of numbness. Eleanor was gone. Marcus had never said goodbye. He had walked away from her without a word, disappeared without telling her what she meant to him, abandoned her just like he had abandoned everything else. The guilt of that hit him like a wave and he bent over and put his head in his hands. 3 days later, Marcus was back in Detroit. He wore the only suit he owned, the same one Eleanor had bought him for his audition, the one that was now too tight across the shoulders and too short in the sleeves because he had grown in the years since the funeral was held at a small church in the old neighborhood. Marcus sat in the back row and watched the other mourners file in. There were people he did not recognize, probably family members who had come from far away. There were neighbors from Greer Street who had known Eleanor in the short time she lived there, and there was his mother, who found him in the back and sat beside him without saying a word. The service was simple and beautiful. People stood up and talked about Eleanor's life, about the concerts she had performed, the students she had taught, the lives she had touched. Someone played a recording of one of her performances, a piece by Chopin that filled the church with such beauty that Marcus had to close his eyes to keep from crying when it was over. The mourners gathered outside to share memories and condolences. Marcus stayed back, not ready to talk to anyone, not sure what he would say. But then a woman approached him. She was middle-aged with Eleanor's same sharp eyes and elegant posture. You must be Marcus, she said. My mother talked about you all the time. I'm Catherine. Her daughter. Marcus shook her hand and mumbled something about being sorry for her loss. Catherine studied him for a long moment, her gaze seeing more than Marcus wanted to show. My mother left something for you. She said she made me promise to give it to you personally. Will you come to the house an hour later? Marcus was sitting in Eleanor's living room for the first time in over 2 years. Everything was the same as he remembered: the books, the paintings, the photographs of faraway places, and in the corner, the grand piano, still beautiful, still waiting. Catherine came in carrying an envelope in a small box. She wrote this for you, Catherine said, handing Marcus the envelope, and this came with it. In the box was a key, old and brass and heavy in his palm. Marcus opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. The paper was thick and cream-colored and covered with Eleanor's elegant script. He began to read. Dear Marcus, if you are reading this letter, then I am gone. If Catherine has done what I asked, then you are sitting in my living room wondering what an old woman could possibly have to say to us. Let me tell you that I know what happened. I know about your father and the piano. Know that you left school and disappeared into the world. I know that you have been lost in the darkness for a long time, and I want you to know that I understand the world is hard. Marcus, it is especially hard for people like us, people who dare to dream, People who carry fire in their hearts, the world does not want us to burn brightly, the world wants to put us out. But here is what I learned in my 80 years of living. The fire is not in the piano, the fire is not in the concert halls or the awards or the applause of fire is in you. It was always in you, it will always be in you. No one can take it away. Marcus, not your father, not the professors who doubted you, not the students who whispered behind your back, not even you yourself. You can try to bury it too, can try to ignore it too, can try to pretend it does not exist, but the fire will always be there, waiting for you to let it burn again. The key in this box opens a storage unit on the west side of the city. Inside that storage unit is my piano. I am leaving it to you. Marcus, not because you need a piano, you could make music on anything. I am leaving it to you because I want you to know that I believe in you. I have always believed in you. I will always believe in you, even from wherever I am now. Play again. Marcus, not for the world, not for fame or success or revenge. Play for yourself. Play because the music is who you are. Play because the silence has gone on long enough with all my love. Elena. Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he held it against his chest and let the tears come. They came slowly at first and then faster. Tears he had been holding back for 2 years. Tears for Eleanor, tears for his grandmother, tears for the boy he used to be and the man he had been afraid to become. Catherine sat quietly and let him cry when he was finally empty. She handed him a tissue and smiled softly. She really did love you. You know, Catherine said, in all the years I knew my mother, I never heard her talk about any student the way she talked about you. She said you had something special. She said the world needed to hear you play. Marcus looked at the key in his hand. It was small and ordinary, but it felt like it held the weight of his entire future. I don't know if I can, he whispered. I don't know if I have anything left. Catherine reached out and squeezed his hand. You won't know until you try. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the storage unit on the west side of the city. His hands were shaking as he put the key in the lock. Their door rolled up with a metallic groan, and in the middle of the empty unit, covered with a white sheet, was Eleanor's grand piano. Marcus walked over and pulled the sheet away. The piano was just as beautiful as he remembered, the dark, polished, with the perfect white and black keys, the years of music and memories embedded in every curve and angle. Marcus sat down on the bench. He placed his fingers on the key stand for a long moment. He just sat there, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath his fingertips. Then he took a deep breath and he began to play. The music that came out was rough and hesitant at first. His fingers had forgotten some of their skill, grown stiff from 2 years of loading boxes instead of pressing keys. But underneath the roughness, something else was there, the fire still burning, still alive, still waiting for him to let it out. Marcus played until the sun went down and the storage unit grew dark. He played until his fingers ached and his arms were tired and his heart was full. And when he finally stopped, he knew that Eleanor had been right. The music was not in the piano, the music was in him. It had always been in him, and it was time to let it speak again. The months that followed Eleanor's funeral were a time of rebuilding. Marcus moved back to Detroit and rented a small apartment not far from Greer Street. He got a job working nights at a hotel, answering phones and checking in guests. A quiet job that left his days free for what really mattered. He had Eleanor's piano moved from the storage unit to his apartment. It barely fit in the living room and there was almost no space left for furniture, but Marcus did not care. He had a piano again, and that was enough. Every morning, after coming home from his shift at the hotel, Marcus would sit at the piano and practice. At first, he just worked on getting his skills back. His fingers had grown clumsy during the lost years and they needed to remember the movements they had once known so well. He played scales and exercises, simple pieces that he had learned as a child, building back the strength and flexibility that had faded away. Then he moved on to harder things. He played the pieces he had studied at Keller, the complicated works that demanded everything he had. He played the compositions he had written before his world fell apart, hearing them again with ears that had grown older and wiser. And then he started to write new music. The compositions that came out of Marcus during this time were different from anything he had created before. They were darker and deeper, full of the pain and loneliness he had experienced during his lost years, but they were also full of something else, hope, a fragile, desperate hope that refused to die. No matter how hard the world tried to kill it, Marcus would lose himself for hours at a time, fingers flying across the keys, pulling melodies out of thin air and weaving them together into something beautiful. Sometimes he would cry while he played, sometimes he would laugh, sometimes he would just close his eyes and let the music carry him away to a place where nothing hurt. Word began to spread through the neighborhood that Marcus Webb was playing again. People would walk by his apartment and stop to listen, just like they used to when he was a boy playing in the basement. Mrs. Patterson from the old street came by one day with a plate of cookies and tears in her eyes. I never thought I'd hear you play again, she said. God bless you, child, for coming back to us. Marcus started performing at small venues around Detroit, open mic nights at coffee shops, Sunday services at churches that needed a piano player, birthday parties and wedding receptions and funeral services. He took any gig he could find, playing for crowds of 5 or 50 or 500, slowly rebuilding his confidence one performance at a time. A year passed, then another. Marcus was 23 now, older than most of the students who had graduated from places like Keller older than the young prodigies who were already making names for themselves in the music world. Some people would have said his chance had passed. Some people would have said he was too old to start over, too far behind to ever catch up, but Marcus was not listening to those people anymore. He was listening to Eleanor's voice in his head, telling him that the fire was still burning. He was listening to his grandmother's piano, destroyed but not forgotten, reminding him where he came from. He was listening to his own heart, finally brave enough to speak after so many years of silence. And then Marcus heard about the National Young Artists Competition. It was one of the biggest piano competitions in the country, held every year in Los Angeles. Young pianists from across America competed for a grand prize that included a cash award, a recording contract, and a performance with one of the top orchestras in the nation. The age limit was 25. Marcus was 23. He had just enough time. The application process was complicated. He needed recordings of his performances. He needed letters of recommendation. He needed to pay an entry fee that took most of his savings, but Marcus did it all. He recorded himself playing in his tiny apartment, using borrowed equipment and software he barely knew how to use. He reached out to teachers and musicians he had met along the way and asked them to write on his behalf. He scraped together every dollar he could find and sent in his application. 3 days before the deadline, months went by, with no word. Marcus tried not to think about it too much. He kept working his job at the hotel. He kept practicing every day. He kept playing gigs around the city. And then one morning, an email appeared in his inbox. Dear Mr. Webb, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a finalist in the National Young Artists Competition. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He read the email 3 more times to make sure he was not dreaming. Marcus was going to Los Angeles. Marcus was going to compete against the best young pianists in the country. Marcus was going to have one more chance to show the world what he could do. The competition was held in a beautiful concert hall with red velvet seats and chandeliers that sparkled like stars. 24 finalists had been selected from hundreds of applicants. They came from the best music schools in the country, Juilliard and Curtis and the New England Conservatory. They had won other competitions and performed with famous orchestras and recorded albums that critics had praised. And then there was Marcus, the dropout from Keller, the kid from Detroit, who had disappeared for 2 years, the unknown name on a list of rising stars. The other competitors looked at him with confusion and curiosity. Who was this person they had never heard of? Where had he come from? What was he doing here among them? Marcus. You heard the whispers and saw the glances, but he did not let them bother him. He had heard worse at Keller. He had survived worse in the lost years. He knew who he was now, and he was ready to show them. The competition lasted 3 days. Each finalist performed twice, once in a preliminary round and once in the finals. The judges were famous pianists and conductors, people whose opinions could shape a career. Marcus played well in the preliminary round, well enough to advance to the finals, but he saved his best for last on the final night. Marcus walked onto that beautiful stage in his old suit that still did not fit quite right. He looked out at the audience, hundreds of faces waiting to hear what he had to say, and he made a decision. He was not going to play the piece he had prepared. He was not going to play something safe and familiar. He was going to play the composition he had written during his darkest days. The piece he called Ashes to Sound. It was a risk. The judges might not understand it. The audience might not connect with it. He might lose everything by going against tradition. But Marcus was done playing it safe. He was done trying to fit into a box that was never made for him. He was ready to burn. Marcus sat down at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And then he began to play. The music that filled that concert hall was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It started soft and broken, like the sound of something precious being destroyed. Then it grew louder and angrier, the notes crashing against each other like waves in a storm. It told the story of a boy who found magic in a basement. It told the story of a father who tried to destroy what he could not understand. It told the story of a teacher who saw fire and helped it burn brighter. It told the story of failure and loss and 2 years of wandering in the darkness. And then, slowly, the music began to change. The anger softened into something like acceptance. The sadness lifted into something like hope. The chaos resolved into something like peace. The final notes of Ashes to Sound hung in the air like a prayer. And then there was silence, complete, absolute silence. Marcus sat at the piano with his hands in his lap and his eyes still closed. He was afraid to look. He was afraid to see the confusion on people's faces, the disappointment in the judges' eyes. He had taken a risk and now he would have to face the consequences. And then the silence broke. One person started clapping, then another, then 100, then the entire audience was on its feet, applauding and cheering and calling out his name. Marcus opened his eyes and saw something he would never forget. The judges were standing to all 5 of them, including a famous conductor who was known for never showing emotion. They were clapping and nodding, and some of them were wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus had done it. He had spoken his truth through the music, and the world had finally heard. 3 days later, the results were announced. Marcus Webb, the dropout, the ghost, the unknown kid from Detroit, had won the National Young Artists Competition. He stood on that stage with the trophy in his hands and cameras flashing in his face and reporters asking questions he could barely hear, and all he could think about was Eleanor. All he could think about was his grandmother. All he could think about was the boy who had pressed a single key in a flooded basement and heard the beginning of everything. They almost stopped him, they almost broke him, they almost silenced him forever, but the music spoke louder than words. And now the whole world was listening. The victory at the National Young Artists Competition changed everything overnight. Marcus Webb went from being a nobody to being a name that people recognized. Newspapers and magazines wrote stories about him. The kid from Detroit who dropped out of music school and disappeared for 2 years before coming back to win the biggest piano competition in the country. Television shows invited him to perform. Record labels called with offers. Concert halls that would never have looked at his application before now begged him to come and play. Marcus was careful about which opportunities he accepted. He remembered what Eleanor had taught him, that the music industry could chew up young artists and spit them out if they were not careful. He signed with a small record label that promised to let him keep creative control. He agreed to a limited touring schedule that would let him keep his roots in Detroit. He made sure that his first major concert after winning the competition would be held in his hometown. The concert was scheduled for a Saturday night in February, almost exactly 10 years after Marcus had first discovered his grandmother's piano in the basement. It would be held at the Fox Theater, one of the most beautiful concert venues in Detroit, a place that Marcus had driven past 1,000 times but never dreamed he would actually perform in. Tickets sold out in 3 days. People came from all over Michigan and beyond, wanting to see the local boy who had made good, wanting to hear the music that had captivated judges and audiences across the country. Marcus's mother was in the front row, wearing a new dress that Marcus had bought for her, crying before the concert even started. Adelana's daughter Catherine had flown in from New York. Old neighbors from Greer Street were there, people who had listened to Marcus play through the basement window when he was just a kid. But there was one person missing, the person who had not responded to the invitation. Marcus had sent one person whose absence was louder than all the applause that filled the theater. Webb. Marcus had not seen or spoken to his father since that terrible winter night when he discovered the destroyed piano. 5 years had passed, 5 years of silence and distance and pain that had never been addressed. Had sent his father a ticket to the concert, along with a short note that said only these words: "I would like you to be there." He had not received a reply. He did not know if his father had even opened the envelope. And now, as Marcus stood backstage waiting to go on, he tried not to think about the empty seat that might be in the audience. 5 minutes. Mr. Webb. Marcus nodded at the stage hand and took a deep breath. He was wearing a new suit this time, one that fit perfectly, tailored especially for this night. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man he barely recognized. The scared boy from the basement was still in there somewhere, but he was surrounded now by something stronger, something that had been forged in the fires of everything Marcus had survived. The lights dimmed in the theater, the audience fell silent, and Marcus Webb walked onto the stage of the Fox Theater to the sound of thunderous applause. He smiled and bowed and made his way to the grand piano that waited for him at center stage. As he sat down on the bench, he let his eyes scan the audience. He saw his mother in the front row, hands clasped together, tears streaming down her face. He saw Catherine nodding encouragingly. He saw old friends and neighbors and strangers who had bought tickets just to hear him play. And then, in the third row, he saw a face that made his heart stop. Raymond Webb. His father was sitting in the third row, wearing a suit that was too big for him because he had lost weight, his hair grayer than Marcus remembered, his face lined with years of hard living. He was staring at Marcus with an expression that Marcus we had never seen before. It was not anger, was not resentment. It was something that looked almost like fear and hope and sorrow and pride all mixed together in a way that made the old man look lost. Marcus stared at his father for a long moment. The audience was waiting. The silence stretched on, and then Marcus placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The concert lasted 2 hours. Marcus played pieces by the great composers, Bach and Beethoven and Chopin. He played jazz standards that made the audience tap their feet and sway in their seats. He played his original compositions, including Ashes to Sound, which brought tears to eyes throughout the theater. And for his final piece, Marcus played something he had written just for this night, something he had never performed before, something called Letter to My Father. The piece started with a single note, low and lonely, like a voice calling out in the darkness. Then other notes joined in, creating a melody that was achingly beautiful and desperately said. It was the sound of a child wanting to be loved. It was the sound of a son reaching out for a father who kept pushing him away. It was the sound of years of silence and pain and words that were never spoken. But then the music began to change. The sadness was still there, but now it was joined by something else: understanding, forgiveness, a recognition that hurt people, that broken people break things, that the sins of the father are not always choices, but sometimes just the best a damaged man can do. The melody grew warmer, more hopeful. It spoke of second chances and new beginnings. It spoke of the possibility that it is never too late to heal, never too late to try again, never too late to say the words that should have been said years ago. Marcus played the final notes with tears rolling down his own face, and when the music stopped, he looked at his father. Raymond was weeping, not the angry tears of a drunk, not the frustrated tears of a man who had given up on himself. These were different tears. These were the tears of a man who had finally heard something he had been deaf to his whole life. The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus barely heard. Ith stood up from the piano and bowed, but his eyes kept going back to his father. And then the concert was over and people were standing and cheering and calling for an encore, but Marcus did not play an encore. He walked off the stage and through the backstage hallways and out a side door that led to the front of the theater. He found his father standing alone on the sidewalk outside. Raymond was staring at the ground, his shoulders shaking, looking smaller and older than Marcus had ever seen him. "Dad," Marcus said. Raymond looked up. His eyes were red and his face was wet and he looked like a man who had just woken up from a terrible dream. "Marcus," he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything, for the piano, for the drinking, for all the years I wasn't the father you deserved. I was angry at the world and I took it out on you, and there's no excuse. There's no excuse for any of it." Marcus looked at his father and felt something shift in his chest. For years he had carried anger toward this man. For years he had blamed him for trying to destroy the best thing in his life. For years he had wondered if his father had ever loved him. At Arbot, standing here now, looking at this broken man crying on a sidewalk in front of a concert hall, Marcus did not feel anger. He felt something else. He felt compassion. He felt understanding. He felt the beginning of something that might, with time and work, become forgiveness. "I heard it," Raymond whispered, "tonight. For the first time, I finally heard it. All those years you played and I never understood what I was listening to. But tonight I heard it. It was beautiful. Son, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Marcus stepped forward and put his arms around his father. It was the first time they had hugged in almost 10 years. Raymond sobbed against his son's shoulder, like a child. "All the walls finally broken. All the defenses finally down. I hear it now, son," Raymond said through his tears. "I finally hear it." And Marcus held his father on that cold February night and let the music of forgiveness play in his heart. Would take time to rebuild what had been broken. There would be hard conversations ahead. There would be setbacks and struggles, and days when the old pain came rushing back. But for now, in this moment, a father and son stood together on a sidewalk in Detroit, and the silence between them was finally filled with something other than fear. It was filled with the first fragile notes of a new song, a song of healing, a song of hope, the song that proved it is never too late to start again. 10 more years passed, 10 years that transformed Marcus Webb from a promising young pianist into one of the most celebrated musicians of his generation. He performed in concert halls on every continent. He recorded albums that won awards and sold millions of copies. He played for presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens, just like Eleanor had done before him. Critics called him a genius. Fans called him an inspiration. Newspapers wrote about the incredible story of the boy from Detroit who almost gave up on his dreams before rising to the top of the music world. But for all his success, Marcus never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the broken streets and empty factories of his childhood neighborhood. He never forgot the people who had believed in him when believing seemed foolish. He never forgot the boy who had discovered magic in a dusty basement and held on to it through everything the world threw at him. And he never forgot his promise to give back. 5 years after his victory at the National Young Artists Competition, Marcus opened the Vance Webb Academy of Music in Detroit. He named it after Eleanor and himself, a tribute to the teacher who had changed his life and a reminder of how far he had come. The academy was located in the heart of the old neighborhood, in a building that had once been an abandoned factory. Marcus had bought the building with his own money and spent 2 years renovating it into something beautiful. There were practice rooms with soundproof walls and the best instruments money could buy. There were classrooms where students could learn music theory and composition and the history of the art form they loved. There were performance spaces where young musicians could experience what it felt like to play for an audience, and there was a scholarship program that made sure no student would ever be turned away because they could not afford the tuition. Marcus hired the best teachers he could find, people who shared his belief that talent could come from anywhere and deserved a chance to grow. He visited the academy whenever he was in Detroit, which was as often as his touring schedule allowed. He would walk through the halls and listen to the sounds of young people practicing and learning and dreaming. He would sit in on lessons and give advice and share stories about his own journey. And sometimes, when the mood was right, he would sit down at one of the pianos and play for the students, showing them what was possible if they worked hard and never gave up. The academy became famous in its own right. Students came from all over the country to study there, drawn by the reputation of its programs and the legend of its founders. Some of them went on to have successful careers in music. Others found that their passion led them in different directions, but all of them left with something valuable: the knowledge that their dreams mattered and that someone believed in them. On a warm September afternoon, Marcus stood in the main hall of the academy, watching as workers hung a new piece of art on the wall. It was a display case made of glass and polished wood. Inside the case was something that looked old and weathered and broken. It was a piece of wood about a foot long and 6 inches wide, with a faded pattern on one side that might once have been decorative. Most people would have thrown it away as garbage, but Marcus knew what it was. It was a piece of his grandmother's piano, the piano that his father had destroyed all those years ago. Marcus had gone back to the old house on Greer Street after his father died 2 years earlier. Raymond had passed away peacefully in his sleep, sober for the last 5 years of his life. Finally at peace with himself and his son while cleaning out the house, Marcus had gone down to the basement one more time and there, hidden under a pile of old boxes, he had found a single piece of the piano that had survived. He had kept it all this time, carrying it with him from city to city, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had gained. Now it would live here, at the academy, where future generations of students could see it and know where their founder had come from next. To the display case hung a large photograph of Eleanor Vance, sitting at her grand piano with a smile on her face and light in her eyes. Below the photograph was a plaque with words that Marcus had written himself. It said, "They almost stopped him, but the music spoke louder than words. May it always speak for those who have no voice." Marcus stood there for a long time, looking at the piece of wood and the photograph and the words on the plaque. He thought about his grandmother, playing her piano while the neighborhood listened through open windows. He thought about Eleanor, seeing fire in a young boy's playing, and deciding to help it burn brighter. He thought about his father, broken by life but healed at the end by the very music he had tried to destroy. He thought about all the students who would walk through these halls in the years to come. Young people with dreams and talent and the same hunger that had burned inside him. The front door of the academy opened and a group of children came running in. They were students from the neighborhood, kids whose families could not afford private lessons, kids who might never have touched a piano if the academy did not exist. They ran past Marcus without recognizing him, too excited about their classes to notice the man standing by the wall. Watched them go with a smile on his face. One of the kids, a little girl with braids and bright eyes, stopped suddenly and turned around. She looked at the display case and the photograph, and then at Marcus. "Are you Mr. Webb?" she asked. "The one who started this school?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, that's me." The little girl tilted her head and looked at him with a curiosity that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. "My mom says you're famous," she said. "She says you play piano better than anyone in the world." Marcus laughed softly. "I don't know about that." He said, "There are a lot of great piano players in the world." The little girl thought about this for a moment. "Well, will you teach me to play like you do?" Marcus looked at this child from the neighborhood where he had grown up, this little girl with dreams in her eyes and music waiting inside her. He knelt down so he was at her level. "I'll tell you what," he said, "I'll teach you everything I know, but I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that when you learn to play, you'll use your music to help other people. Promise me that you'll never forget where you came from or the people who helped you along the way. Promise me that when you see someone with talent and no opportunity, you'll reach out and give them a chance. Can you promise me that?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "I promise, Mr. Webb." Marcus smiled and stood up. "Good," he said. "Now go to your class. We have a lot of work to do." The little girl ran off to join her friends, her braids bouncing behind her. Marcus watched her go and felt something warm spread through his chest. This was why he did it, not for the fame or the awards or the applause, but for moments like this, for the chance to plant seeds that would grow into something beautiful, for the opportunity to speak for those who had no voice, for the privilege of passing on the gift that had been given to him outside the windows of the academy. The streets of Detroit were coming back to life. New businesses were opening, old houses were being repaired, people were returning to a neighborhood that had once been left for dead. Would take time. Marcus knew healing always takes time, but it was happening, slowly but surely, one note at a time, just like his own life, just like his own story, just like the music that had spoken for him when he had no words. Marcus walked over to the grand piano that stood in the corner of the main hall. It was Eleanor's piano, the one she had left him, the one that had brought him back from the darkness. He sat down on the bench and placed his fingers on the keys, and then he began to play. The music filled the hall and drifted out through the open windows. It floated down the streets of the neighborhood, yet reached the ears of the children in their classrooms and the workers in the newly opened shops and the families in the houses that were no longer abandoned. It was the sound of a man who had almost been was the sound of dreams that had almost been destroyed. It was the sound of fire that had refused to die. It was the sound of hope, hope for everyone who had ever been told they were not good enough, hope for everyone who had ever been pushed down and told to stay down, hope for everyone who had music inside them, waiting to be heard. They almost stopped him, but the music spoke louder than words, and it always will.